if you have an ankle sprain, the last thing we actually want to do is what's called the RICE protocol. That's rest, ice, compression, and elevation. So if we look at a consortium and expert agreement on the topic of ankle sprain and ankle sprain prevention in the future, they actually looked at comparative analyses in studies looking at ankle sprains that were treated with improvements in return to function and return to activity very quickly, based on symptoms and based on some of the structures that were damaged, versus solely rest, ice, compression, and elevation. And what they found was that there was no extra benefit to rest, ice, compression, and elevation. So no extra benefit to RICE. So what this means is that we really want to get people back to activities as quickly as possible.